Okay. So Claire Duggan is the co-PI of the Northeastern University STEP project, which is now running on fumes, I understand. Yeah, so it's they're in their no-cost extension. Claire has been very helpful to us over the last couple of years, and especially this year, serving on the advisory committee to help plan this meeting and to help push STEP Central along. So in order to get the advisory committee more involved in some of the meeting activities, I've asked her if she would mind introducing Uri Treisman. So Claire.
So good morning. I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Treisman a couple years ago when he came to Boston to speak to a group of students that were involved, I know I'm short, right, who were involved with our calculus field day competition, kind of a culmination of work of a colleague of mine, Dr. Robert Case, with the students in the city of Boston. In Boston, ironically, over 14 years ago, calculus was only taught in the non-exam schools, and Dr. Case was on a mission to bring calculus to every school in the city of Boston. And I'm happy to say that we actually have our calculus field day again in a couple weeks. So Dr. Treisman, in all of his work, advocates for equity and excellence in education for all children. I saw as he walked around the audience, even before this event was starting this morning, just to get a sense of who is here and the passions that you equally share about children in K-12, community college, and clearly their success in higher education. I'm not going to read all of it. He's currently a professor of mathematics and public affairs at the University of Texas at Austin and director of the Dana Center. He serves on multiple boards, the New Teacher Project, which focuses on education resource strategies, the American Federation of Teachers Innovation Fund, Math Teacher Circle, and the Community College Survey of Student Engagement. He's a senior advisor to the Aspen Institute. He recently served on the 21st Century Commission on the Future of Community Colleges and was named a MacArthur Fellow in 1992 for his work on nurturing minority student achievement. In 2006, he was nominated as Scientist of the Year by the Harvard Foundation for his outstanding contributions to mathematics. He's gained wide acclaim for his research at the University of California, Berkeley, specifically on the factors that support high achievement among students of color in mathematics. How we can enable all students, especially those who are underserved, to achieve post-secondary success is the foundation of all of Dr. Treisman's work. This is the mission that drives the work of the Dana Center. One of his most recent projects is a new pathway project, which he's going to share a little bit more with you, talking about really some of the guiding principles that he hopes will begin to accelerate the transformation that is so critically needed to bring about the kind of success that we need in our community colleges and in higher education. I'm not going to go into detail. Dr. Treisman doesn't have a PowerPoint, so I figured I'd put a few these things on a slide so that it can be shared with all of you if you would like to follow up with some of his work and the work of the Dana Center. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Treisman.
So when I took calculus in high school, there were 7,000 students in the U.S. who also took it that year. This year, 1/3 of all American high school students who go directly to higher ed have calculus on their high school transcripts. So that's more than 700,000 students. And when you think about what happens to them, 50% of all the students who take calculus in high school. So if you take calculus in high school, yes, there's unevenness in the programs. Some of the courses are weaker than others. But if students are in high school calculus, they're pretty serious students. 50% of them start college in a course they already took in high school. About 1/4 of them are placed into algebra by horrible placement exams. 1/3 of them criminal enterprise. 1/3 of them never take another math course, and of the remaining 1/6, right, half, a third, a sixth, mathematics, right. Lower mathematics, right. About 40% of the sixth who do continue get W's, D's, F's, or I's. You just think of the disconnects. 20 years ago, there were 110,000 students who started their freshman year in college in second semester calculus. Last year, there were only 84,000. And this is not because high school students are getting weaker. It's just fundamental disconnects between K-12 and higher ed. All the evidence is that American public education is getting stronger. Universally, college faculty think it's getting weaker. Right? And the massive number of people who sign up for courses like calculus are invisible in our programs. That's not what I plan to talk about, but what the hell, it was a setup. So first of all, I know I've met about a quarter of you, and it's good to come to these meetings to see a lot of friends. This is Washington, D.C., so I should call you unindicted co-conspirators in the work. We were talking back there with evaluators of this, and so many of you were faculty members or administrators who were the campus advocates for students. People who worked really hard to inspire your students to pursue STEM careers or to create programs that nurtured students. And many of you now are in a position where you're asking, should this be a special program or should this really be institutional practice? Right? And that's the thing I'm going to focus on in this talk, because there is a tectonic plate shift going on. Right, in the United States. 34 states have introduced legislation to change the way public institutions of higher ed are funded. Right? And that funding formula is driven, the new funding formulas are driven strongly toward completion of certificates, licenses, and degrees. So in the past, a lot of the work that NSF has funded, and a lot of the most beautiful work has been funded by NSF, has been often a silo, and when the grant ended, the next grant was sought and a new initiative occurred. There were never any systemic forces on your campuses that caused the president and the governing board to look carefully at what you were doing, despite our best hopes at NSF, and say, how do we take these programs and make them core to institutional practice? So all of a sudden, this is changing. 34 states, it will be in more than 40 states, according to ECS projections, in the next legislative cycle. So why is this tectonic plate shift coming about? Well, there are two reasons. There's an imagined reason. 52% of employers claim that they can't hire people for their jobs, their open job openings. And there's some truth to that, but not a lot. Actually, the problem is low salaries. You know, if there were actually shortages in most areas, Economics 1 tells you wages would go up. In fact, engineering wages are going down, right? With the exception of a small number of areas, like oil field discoveries, right, where there's a short-term mismatch. And in some mid-career STEM fields, where everybody's projection across the political spectrum is we'll need at least 1 million new STEM certificates and degrees in the next decade. Most of it is the fight, the historic fight between industry and education about who should actually pay for the training of workers. That's what it's actually about. And what we're seeing in globalization is two things. Efficiency and productivity increases means there's no one left in companies to do job training or outreach and apprenticeships. And with globalization, fewer and fewer companies feel committed to their local place. So this is not just a US phenomena. The beautiful apprenticeship programs in Denmark, in Germany, and Switzerland are also falling apart because productivity increases mean there's no one who can run those efforts. So part of the pressure to increase our degrees, not necessarily that it's bad, is coming about because of economic forces in industry. But the biggest force in legislation is coming from the fear of downward mobility. That's really the political driver. You all know this is the first generation in which children are expected to do less well than their parents. And Americans, we're a wonderful people, but we do have some character faults. One of our character faults is that we prefer nostalgia to actual history. Right? So we have this mythology that because the founding fathers, people carry the Constitution in their briefcases in Washington, D.C., right, as the protectors of them, somehow they think that democracy will always be here, right, because of the founding fathers in these documents. Actually, democracies are very fragile. Smart policymakers know this. And if people can no longer improve their life through hard work and education, our basic social contract is threatened. That undermines democracy. And across the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, in my work in legislatures and with governor's offices, people are truly worried about this, and they know that education is the only remaining route to upward mobility. It used to be government jobs for poor people. They're disappearing really quickly. It used to be the military, especially for people of color, and those military is downsizing. Poor people can't pass the test to get into the military. Small business is under severe constraints and is not hiring. So really, it's us that's the force for upward mobility in society. And how bad is the problem? Intergenerational elasticity of income. Great use of logarithms and differential calculus to understand what that is. But we have actually fallen behind France and Italy in the rate at which you can advance given your parents' income. The idea that we would be behind France, we're just about tied with the UK, with the second or third worst country in the world in terms of income elasticity. That's what's actually driving the policy agenda toward completion. Industry pressures to subsidize their workforce training, which is understandable, and deep structural changes in American life. If too many Americans no longer believe that they have paths upward, we are in trouble. And for upper income people, degrees don't matter so much. Actually, 89% of all people in the top quartile of income earn a BA within 6 years. It's 11% for people in the bottom quartile of income. Right? Just think of that. So this is about low-income people actually having a route up, and if you're poor, a certificate or license or degree profoundly matters to your upward mobility, much more so than for middle and upper income people. So when we hear people arguing about factoring versus completing the square and having deep emotional debates about what should be taught, it's worthwhile to take a breath and step back and remember what we're actually working on, which is the viability and continuation of our democratic traditions and social contract. At least half our energy should be focused on that, rather than whether students should all be able to rationalize binomial surd denominator or do tricky factoring of quartics. So, funding formulas get the attention of administrators. So how is higher ed responding? Then I'm going to shift to talk about my visits to 40 campuses and innovation that I really respect and lessons from it. And then I'm going to talk a little about the need to design at scale rather than designing pilot projects. What I see is the next iteration of your work. So how is universities responding? Universities are old institutions. We have evolved incredibly efficient immunological systems to thwart even the most beneficial of viruses affecting our cores. And how do we do this? Well, you're the president. There's an initiative out here. You serve as the buffer. You create a task force. You create a P20 business council in which each sector hires somebody with little influence in their own sector to meet with the people in the other sectors. I personally think they should all hire out-of-work actors, so at least we'd be contributing to the arts. Then there's an army of 18-year-old, physically well-toned consultants from McKinsey, Bridgespan, BCG, and Parthenon, spouting the language of productivity, which should cause you to run screaming from the room. Very bright young people who could be replaced by a computer program, because they're all giving virtually isomorphic advice. This is a symbolic plane of activity. But because it's about money and actually how our institutions are going to be funded, we're seeing real structural change taking place, operational activity, not just symbolic activity, which is designed to protect the core. Right? And you can see this in several ways. Real questions are being asked about the viability of programs, and real questions are being asked about enrollment. And one of the reasons is the first institutions that stood up and actually adopted completion-oriented practices, the Oregon community colleges, the Georgia system, they eliminated late enrollment, mandatory advising, all the things the research shows is necessary, all experienced drops in enrollment because students didn't organize their lives so they could do them. And as soon as they adopted completion-oriented practices, enrollment fell, which threatened their fiscal viability, because their current funding is based mostly on enrollment, not on success. That's what's really getting the attention of presidents. So presidents, for the first time, and their governing boards are asking hard questions. Why aren't students graduating in STEM? Right? We can't just hire people as we used to solve the problem. We have to ask, how are our real institutional resources being deployed? The whole history of minority programs and women's programs and access programs is, well, let's not touch the real departments. Let's hire people around the edges to fix the problem. And that's not working anymore, because we have 40 years of data to show that none of those innovations actually survive, right? They're always funded with soft dollars, which tells you about real institutional commitments. And that is changing because of state policy and national need. So, what else happening on the real level? So for the last 4 years, I've been visiting campuses as part of my work on the redesign of community colleges and access four-year institutions. That means I've spent the first day of a visit teaching in the institution. I've learned that it's impossible to learn what's going on in an institution just by speaking to the president or provost. The first lesson is, every president I've spoken to has a virtually identical description of their institution. This is stunning. So principle one is rhetoric scales faster than practice. They all have learning communities. They all have boot camps. They all have case management. Right? They've all shifted their IR from compliance to improvement. I mean, virtually in 40 case studies, virtually no identifiable differences in the institutional description of a place when described by the president. But when you go in and you teach for a day, so usually I teach like a developmental course, calculus, linear algebra, right? Your cross-section of math courses. It's hard to believe that the places all have the same name of higher ed. In some places, it feels like you're in some Midwestern gas station where students drive up, get filled up, and drive away. Nobody is hanging around. And in other places, it feels like you're in a community center. I was in Indian River in Florida. As soon as I walk on, the gardeners, stop me. Where are you going? Are you a new student here? Me, am I a new student? Right? I mean, it's stunning. Students hanging around. Math departments that have hired students and replaced student support personnel with their own students. I mean, really fundamental differences. So lesson one is that rhetoric doesn't actually reflect practice. Lesson 2 is that pilots do not scale. So I was at a large institution in Ohio, and I had the faculty math department, my kindred spirits. We put a butcher paper around the room, and it's a large department, and we did an exercise. Write down every effort you remember in your career to improve retention in math, recruit students into math, improve performance. 81 different initiatives were remembered. Then we did some descriptive statistics. Turned out the mean length of an initiative was about 3 years. 1.5 faculty were involved. About a quarter of the faculty were, at any time in their career, were involved in an improvement effort. About half the faculty were occasionally involved, and a quarter just sort of did their own thing. So at the end of this, we did the descriptive statistics, and then I asked the question, which of these have replaced institutional practice, had become normative practice? And the answer was 0. So I'm ready for my, Xanax or whatever it is, clinical depression. So I'm being driven by the vice president for academic affairs to the airport after the day. And I said to him, man, wasn't that depressing? And he said, oh, no, Uri, you don't understand. All those grants, they're about faculty development. They're not really about institutional change. But that's in fact the reality, right? They're really seen as ways of mobilizing, supporting, entertaining the faculty who are working with students. Almost no pilot project. There are a handful of exceptions, but almost no pilot project has ever scaled and become institutional. NSF knows this in its heart. It's a joke at the coffee counter. But we're addicted to this mythology that pilots will scale. We need to end that mythology and talk about designing for scale rather than praying for scale. The third is the myth of the N. It's usually 7. Exemplary practices, high-yield, powerful practices. One of my closest friends is a devout Mormon, and he calls this the Mormon approach to institutional improvement. My people prefer guilt-based approaches. My wives prefer shame-based approaches. But the fact is, when you list these exemplary practices and then you look at the literature, RCTs done on these, they virtually always show 0 effect. And there is a beautiful literature on this in K-12. Some of the great figures, Jimmy Spillane, Richard Elmore, really the brilliant thinkers of K-12 used to believe, it's an exercise, I used to believe this, I now believe this. Every year on January 1st, when we get up, we should sit down, close our eyes, take a deep breath, and say, I used to believe this, I now believe this, and honor what we've learned. One of the things we've learned in K-12 is that just as many crappy institutions have those practices as good institutions, which is why when you do randomized controlled trials of things named learning communities or boot camps, you get 0 effect. This was the What Works Clearinghouse, remember that? I always hoped that NSF would create what should have worked clearinghouse. And then DARPA could have created a what had no chance in hell of working clearinghouse. But it turns out that practices matter, but the catalyst for making them matter is institutional culture and relational trust. And probably the single best research study in education in the last 30 years, a masterpiece of rigor and clarity, is Tony Bragg's Organizing Schools for Improvement. And he shows 7 years of rich data that in institutions without relational trust catalyzed by leadership, no intervention works. right? He actually built causal models for this. So the natural thing is say, what works, let's put it in place and hope that will be catalyzed into achievement. It's culture and relational trust on campuses that turns practices into student achievement. It's not the 7, 10, 12, 15. I can do that improvement in 6 highly effective practices. So that's one of the big myths. The fourth, one of the most painful myths, is that remediation works. Remediation is a burial ground for the aspirations of myriad students, mostly poor people, hoping for a better education. Every big data set shows that if students are referred to remediation, they're more likely to end up with debt than with a certificate, license, or degree. And our institutions have hired an army of contingent workers making $1,800 to $2,700 a course to work with poor people and put it over here in a little remedial ghetto. So what's the data? About 5.9% of students referred to math remediation pass a college math course in their first year. About a quarter of them ever pass a college math course. At a large community college in Southern California, as part of my visits, I asked the institutional research people if I could meet with all the students who started in level 1 remediation who completed the calculus sequence over 3 years. I was going to take them to dinner, do a focus group, film them, and capture their stories. Her name was Rosa Martinez. Charming woman. It took her 7 years to get through, engineering aide, amazing person. But here's a hint. I teach advanced statistical modeling at the University of Texas. When you can name everyone in your sample, you're in trouble. You don't need third-order moments or probability distributions, anything of that sort. Here's a photograph. She's the one who made it through. This is criminal. Right? It's become a cost center in most institutions. This is unethical, and funding little dinky improvements of remedial education is not helping people of color or low-income people succeed. The problem, yes, failure rates are high, but here's the failure rates based on Florida complete data and California data. 59% of African American students in regular college credit math courses get W's, D's, F's, or I's. 53% of Hispanics, 40% of whites, and 37% of Asians. So we have armies of people trying to build a 6-lane highway into a swamp. People love working on remediation because it's another way to divert attention from the core courses and structures in our institutions, which have deep dry rot. So I started in community college. I started in the horticulture program. I worked for 5 years in grounds and maintenance at Los Angeles Community College. I remember my first course at Pierce Community College, Gardening 101. Robert Connell, I was so lucky. He was the main landscaper at UCLA. He walked out and he said, 2 lessons, day 1. Don't build a garden before you watch where people walk. Never build structures on weak foundations. Yes, most important lesson I've had in all my years of education. If we're really going to build structures, focusing on remediation without focusing on the strong anchors in K-12 and in our institutions is going to fail. And poor people and people of color are going to be the primary victims of that institutional irresponsibility. The next myth is that high school, the problem is essentially decrepit American high schools. We have allowed the rhetoric of failure to dominate discussions of public education, but not higher ed. We're Teflon covered. The danger of focusing on the putative weaknesses of American K-12 education, and we have to be careful of this when the flashlight shines on us, is that the negativity has turned what used to be a beacon of hope in America, public education, into a symbol of government failure. So data is critical, and we need to understand our weaknesses, but we had better understand our strengths first. Because if we fail to present a balanced view of our institutions, we too will end up being seen as a symbol of government failure, rather than for the important roles we actually play. K-12, we've allowed secretaries of education of both parties to characterize K-12 as a complete and total failure. To show this stupid PISA data, which is completely misrepresentative, and no one talks about the TIMSS data, which just came out, in which U.S. states participated as countries, and Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina outperformed every European country, and Finland, which came in top on PISA, underperformed the U.S. national average. No discussion of this in the press, because we're addicted to failure as a driver for improvement. Discussion of failure and threat produces a short-term blip in behavior followed by denial. That's what social psychologists have learned. We have to be very careful about the portrayal of those institutions. The real data is we've seen increases in calculus enrollment. In 1982, only half of American high school students took Algebra 1 and geometry. Most states now are requiring 3 or 4 years of mathematics. My state 4. We hope it will stay that way. What we haven't done is build bridges from the new strengths of high school advanced course taking into the freshman year of college. The institutions that have done that, South Texas College in the Rio Grande Valley, now has 12,084 high school students who are poor and middle performing enrolled in their regular college classes out of 31,000. Remediation has dropped from 40% to 16.1% in a decade, and the number of people transferring to four-year institutions in STEM-related areas is accelerating enormously. Long Beach City College and Long Beach ISD, fundamentally changing how we actually coordinate and articulate work across systems. This is going to be critical. Why is it hard? Because community colleges remember when they were part of K-12. They have a creation myth of separating from K-12, and whenever they talk about reconnecting, it activates in the genome some kind of immune response. All right? And we have to be very careful about this, because students all need some form of higher education, and we need to stop thinking of artificial barriers between high school and college. The 12th year needs to be an innovation zone. Look at the places that have early college high schools, massive dual and concurrent enrollment. We used to think, in most states still have legislation that only college-ready kids can do dual enrollment. It turns out to be the non-college-ready kids who are benefiting most from it. Right? So we need to re-examine policies that artificially limit students' progression to higher ed. Higher ed loves college readiness because it frames the problem as someone else's responsibility. The most creative act in American higher ed today in most places is blocking the upward flow of accountability and transparency. People are terrified of it, but we need to get past that and reconnect centrally to students moving through. Last piece of myth is that systems will solve the problem. This idea is so stunning that everyone has their 10 practices. For those of you who are organizational theorists, DiMaggio and Powell, neo-institutionalism, institutions don't actually optimize for quality. They optimize for legitimacy. That's why all police departments, which are locally run, look identical. Studies in the nanotechnology and biotech industries have shown that within 6 months of new innovative industries, they're structurally identical within 6 months, because that's driven by the VC and funding. They need to be perceived as legitimate. Did I hear the word MOOC? Literally, presidents are giving these idiots millions of dollars. They don't know what the hell it is, but they need a MOOC. So they want MOOC for poor kids. They want MOOCs for developmental education. It's amazing. This is optimizing for legitimacy, and it's what organizational theory projects. But systems are not going to solve this problem alone. Every study of minority student success and first-gen success, Kay McClenny's beautiful studies, SESI studies, NESI studies, SEN studies, my studies of interviews with 700 students, sophomores, more than half the successful candidates named an individual who they assign responsibility for their success. We're not going to produce a system that's person-free. The question, human interaction matters profoundly. We are the carriers of acculturative information, right? We are the translators. We are the ones who invite people into these fields. Yes, we can use technology more creatively, right? But we're not going to build a system that significantly reduces the number of people involved in this, because this is really a culturative process that involves people inviting people into our world. And it's hard to imagine that being automated without having devastating effects on the cultures that we're trying to bring people into. So now, design at scale. In Texas, largely out of fear of legislative action and being fed up with foundations that create the agenda for institutions, presidents got together and noticed that most of their strong people are working on short-term grants, and the purpose of those grants is set by outsiders, not by institutional strategy. So the 50 presidents of Texas community colleges got together with my center at UT, with the Higher Ed Coordinating Board, now at the legislature, it looks like it's going to be set, and agreed to redesign the core pathways from high school into college mathematics and into programs of study, block replacing the whole remedial enterprise that's largely failed students. So I want to talk a little about design at scale, what's involved, and where you, as the people on your campuses who are most associated with student success and advancement, need to move your work in the next phase of what we hope will be NSF work for scale. NSF rarely talks about systemic change. It got bitten politically about that. But most of the people who bit it are now dead, right? So it's time to bring back the real work that our government needs to do to build systems that work. We've been in a period of policy miniaturization, focusing on bad teachers, not teachers and administrators as a whole, focusing on schools that fail kids, not on the systems that created those schools. It's time to move from miniature policy to system policy once again. So Einstein, remember his great thing, that if you work on a hard problem, make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler? Right? And make sure by all means you're working on the right problem. So in the redesign of remediation, the right problem is the gateway courses. What are they gateways to? Rather than enrolling students in courses, students need to be part of coherent programs that they make based on best evidence that they have. So first, content. I have interviewed too many firemen, EMTs, interior designers who've completed everything except college algebra. California, 2 years ago, 35,000 students taking developmental ed courses for the 5th or greater number of times. One community college in Oregon had no openings in remedial math. All the sections were filled by people who failed it the year before. And what is it? College algebra. This is horrible. I was one of the guys who advocated for algebra for all. What we got was algebra forever for our students. I want to here now publicly apologize for this algebra 2 crap. Right? We need to make sure that the content of freshman courses is the right content for coherent programs of study. And that means that many of the students in soft STEM fields and in non-STEM fields should be taking statistics and real quantitative literacy courses that teach them the deep use of basic mathematical ideas. Unfortunately, about 11% of adult workers use algebra in their work, according to the new ONET studies. The most common use for algebra by American adults is helping their kids with their algebra homework. That's not a good enough reason to keep people out of EMT programs. But you can't change that on your campuses. This is the first thing about the zoning for scale. Some things can be dealt with at the campus level, but if you change this on your campus, how do you know that the institution down the road is going to accept it? Articulation, applicability rules, this has to happen at the state level, not at the campus level, reinforced by the National Professional Associations certifying the outcome standards. Otherwise, completion agenda will threaten access and quality, and we'll get contemporary math courses that should properly be called Our Friends the Numbers. That would be a betrayal, right, of our disciplinary identities. So the first thing is, now people assume I'm a flaming radical. Those of you who know me know I'm actually a fairly conservative person. I believe that when we mess around with deeply embedded structures of higher ed, there should be a very high bar for change. Reformers always believe the future will be better. Administrators know the future can be a lot worse. We have to be very careful when we muck around with deeply embedded structures. But by any standard, the bar has been met for re-examining the content. We can't let our entry programs be shaped more by the weight of history than by the actual mathematical and scientific needs of our programs of study and our economy and our society. But you can't do this alone. We have to do this through our state organizations and professional organizations. The second is structure. Long sequences of courses do not work for people today. If you look at remediation, this is a 1 million+ student database. 2/3 of all the students who take a developmental course pass it. They drop out between the courses because they're too long. In my studies for the Department of Defense, all these people are saying, yeah, I'm ready to retire when I finish this sequence. Right? We need acceleration, but you can't build new course sequences just on your own campus. This needs to be at the state level, and because so many students go to institutions in several states, if they're in certain urban areas, this needs to be nationally set by professional associations. We need to rethink content and legitimate course structures. The third big piece is delivery. Our students lead complex lives, and everyone is looking for a magic bullet, the silver bullet. I'm a Texan now, right? We believe in silver buckshot. Right? Everyone, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, picks on something, emporium, hybrid, praying that it will be the answer for their modularization. What we're actually seeing is that these systems help some people and hurt others. And we need to have a system in place with IR that allows us to get the right student in the right structure at the right time. And we have to give up on magic bullets. Most of us will need a diversity of modern technology-driven approaches. And that will be a failure unless we have the IR systems behind them that actually support student progress. Biggest area, and the most controversial, is student support. We have reviewed 29 student success programs and strategies. They're largely an accident of what the person who created them knew about. Most of them are driven by folklore, and most of them are run by people who have no faculty or high-end status on their campuses. So let's just go back historically and talk about what really needs to be changed. In the 1950s, when developmental ed, student learning centers came about, why did they come about? GI Bill and civil rights. The faculty were for vets and for civil rights in their personal lives, but overwhelmingly against civil rights and GI Bill in their institutional lives. Faculty thought that this would degrade the quality of their institutions. How could those returning vets integrate into our campuses? What happened was natural. We were speaking about a small population of students of color and returning guys in their mid-20s. The administration took responsibility for them. They built the first student learning centers in the basement of the administration building. And guess what? The faculty didn't say, if they're the student learning center, what the hell are we? Faculty was perfectly happy with all of this. Basically give up responsibilities for student success. Now we have a giant industry of student support with no real authority over much on their campuses. And our campuses actually look like America. Most of our access institutions have solved the democratization access problem, and we have one group of faculty teaching courses, and we have an equal-sized group of people trying to help students succeed in them. Think we got a problem here structurally? This is the time to ask, because of the completion agenda and changes in funding, how do we recenter responsibility for student success in the core of faculty work? And how do we articulate the work of student affairs professionals with real expertise and core faculty work? First 2 weeks on the campuses when we visited, shows up in Kay McClenny's work, the tutors are just waiting for people to show up. If you're 1 week behind in my math class, no student tutor is going to help you catch up. You're dead meat. The whole theory of this is incredibly stupid. It's time to rethink this. All the student support personnel should be in the classrooms of students on day one in mandatory orientations under the direction of the faculty responsible for the course content. That is going to be some political battle, but it's the core battle that has to take place. Next, the actual content of advising. We looked at it, traced it back to 19th century moral education in religious colleges. There's virtually no evidentiary base for it. So a little bit of what we're learning about real student problems. Student success has a bunch of problems students experience. It puts it into a 16-week course and teaches it to students just when they don't need it. What we now know from pico-economic modeling, George Ainsley's work, hyperbolic discounting, overwhelmingly students who start our colleges are positive they're going to succeed. If they're weak, the first thing that happens is they get hit by the pace of instruction. Oh my God, I've never had to do anything like this. No one's telling me exactly how to study. First homework assignment they get back. I got a C, like it's a lottery. Maybe if they take it back again, it'll be a B this time. No ability to calibrate. As soon as that happens, students' confidence drops. And as soon as their confidence drops, they hedge their bets by increasing their work hours by 1 or 2 and their activities by 1 or 2. And you can map out the cycle of disengagement. So by the 5th week, depending on who they are culturally, they're either gone physically or gone mentally, still in class. The higher performing students come in with high motivation, but they've really sharp kids, but they don't know about higher ed life. So they're positive they're going to succeed. And then they have a big success, and they have a big success, and they work fewer hours, and then they realize, holy shit, this is the consequence I have now of going to a weak school and not really focusing on education. They now get how hard it's going to be to actually be an engineer or a doctor, and their confidence drops. And the research shows that the biggest predictor of withdrawal is a drop in confidence from whatever level you have, and they start questioning whether they made a good choice, whether they really belong in college. David Yeager's work about to be published based on 1,100 students in 29 colleges. The biggest single predictor of withdrawal for students in the first semester is questioning whether they made a good decision about participating in higher ed. So we now have an evidentiary base about student success. None of that appears in traditional student support. That is where the real engineering and demolition work is going to have to be. Who are all the people responsible for student success, and how do we reorganize them around students? Last, faculty. Right. If we're going to recenter responsibility for students in faculty roles, you should keep track of what my colleagues derisively call Uri Treisman's second law of educational thermodynamics. It's the only law that can be quoted in mixed company. The second law says that you cannot scale activities that require increased output from busy people. Deep law of educational thermodynamics. If we're going to recenter responsibility for student success in the faculty, rather than pray that an NSF grant is going to fix the problem, we have to think deeply and structurally about the purpose of our institutions and how the mission of our institutions should drive our budgets. We have a moment to do that. People are cynical about higher ed's ability to change. Mark Udov said, as a chancellor, he said, being a chancellor of a university system is like being a caretaker in a cemetery. There are lots of people under you, but no one's listening. People forget that higher ed has changed enormously when national need required it. After World War II, we built the most amazing research enterprise on the planet, right? We reconstructed higher ed around national need. The need today is driven by downward mobility. We need engines of education that allow people to improve their lives through hard work and effort, or our social contract will collapse. We will lose our international competitiveness over time. Jan Tinbergen, first Nobel Prize in economics, 1947, really mapped out the macroeconomic relations between education. It's not short-term, it's long-term. The country is calling upon us to make fundamental structural changes like we made in the 50s, and we can do it. And it's the people in this room and the people who've worked on these pilots who are the activists for change. We need to rethink what it means to work on our work in a silo separate from the real institution, and what it means to move it to the center of institutions. If we change from access to completion, if we retain the access role, everything else about our institutions will have to change. And our job is to ensure the integrity of content and disciplinary integrity in the midst of that change. Thank you.